Big Shaq returns to Cypress Hills for a promise he never broke, but at his friend's grave he finds a crying waitress and a child wearing his shoes. She doesn't know Quincy, but she left a note with his name on it. A buried truth is clawing its way back. A murder, a cover-up, and a child tied to both. Now Shaq must choose. Protect the silence, or burn the lies down. What if the man the town buried was the only one telling the truth? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Cypress Hills stood like a monument to time. Its rows of gravestones cracked and moss-kissed. Its silence deep and undisturbed, except by the wind threading through the pines. The sun hung soft and wide over Brooklyn, bleeding gold into the sky, casting long, tired shadows across the headstones. This wasn't just a cemetery. For Shaquille O'Neal, this was a ritual, a promise. One made in the heartbeat of grief and kept in the quiet of every July for the last 18 years. Shaq arrived like he always did, understated. Sweatpants, hoodie pulled over his head, sunglasses shielding his eyes even though he didn't need to hide. People in this part of the city didn't bother him much. They knew the story, or thought they did. But no one knew Quincy like Shaq did. No one saw the real picture in those headlines, or felt the ripples that boy's death made in the life of a man who would one day become Big Shaq. The familiar gravel path crunched beneath his sneakers. His frame moved slow, not because of age or wear, but reverence. He passed the same broken bench, the same crooked angel statue, the same tree that had once hidden a bottle of cheap whiskey they shared when they were 17, and defiant. Each year, these pieces of the past waited for him like quiet witnesses. The grave was easy to find. Third row down, 2 plots to the left of the faded U.S. flag planted in the soil of a war vet's name. Quincy Roman Wells. The marker read, no flowers, no pictures, just a date, a dash, and too much story left untold. Shaq stood still, hands in his pockets, letting the silence work its way into his chest. He remembered the last day they spoke, Quincy full of fire, talking about music and leaving town, trying to outgrow the violence without letting it erase him. That night, Quincy disappeared. The papers said it was an accident, a gang conflict gone wrong. But Shaq never believed that, not once. Quincy wasn't perfect, but he wasn't disposable either. He was just about to kneel when something shifted in the breeze, a soft sound, not the rustling of leaves or distant birds, a muffled sob. Shaq's head turned slowly. A few rows ahead, near a section where the headstones were newer and more polished, a woman knelt. Young, probably late 20s, wearing a stained uniform and apron that spoke of long shifts and low tips. Her shoulders quivered, her arms wrapped tight around herself, and beside her stood a small child, maybe 5, maybe 6, a boy with oversized sneakers and bright, watchful eyes. He clung to her hip like she was the only thing in the world keeping him grounded. Shaq watched, unsure if it was the sadness or the familiarity of it that hit harder. She wasn't crying like someone who had lost a father or a husband. Her grief felt displaced, like she didn't know why she was crying, only that she couldn't stop, and something about that broke open a door inside him he didn't know was still locked. He stayed still, quiet, not wanting to intrude, but the boy saw him. His gaze sharp and solemn, too old for his years. For a moment they just looked at each other. No words, just 2 strangers sharing the same quiet field of sorrow. Then the woman rose slowly, brushing off her apron with trembling hands. She glanced around, then down at the headstone, touching it like it might speak back to her. Then she did something that tightened Shaq's chest. She pulled a folded note from her pocket and placed it gently on the grave. She whispered something, lips barely moving, and turned to walk away. Shaq squinted. The grave she was kneeling at, it was Quincy's. She'd cried there, left a note there, but Shaq had never seen her before. She wasn't part of Quincy's family. He didn't know her face. And the kid, no resemblance, no connection that made sense. The woman didn't look back as she walked, her hand clutching the boy's tightly. They moved toward the edge of the cemetery, where the cracked asphalt met rusted chain-link fencing. Shaq stayed frozen. There was something off-kilter in the air now, a sensation he couldn't name. A mystery walked past him, holding a child and leaving behind a note on a grave of someone she had no reason to mourn. When the wind died down, Shaq stepped forward. He approached the grave, his eyes scanning the fresh scuff marks in the soil, the slight indent where her knees had pressed. The note tucked under a rock fluttered faintly. He knelt, pulled his sunglasses off and reached for it. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged. To Big Shaq. I'm sorry. I never knew. Not until now. Please forgive me. That was it. No name, no context, but it was meant for him. A chill settled over his spine. The words struck like a whisper from a ghost. She had written to him, not Quincy. She knew who he was, but he had never seen her in his life. Her apology wasn't generic. It was deliberate, personal. He stood slowly, eyes scanning the direction she'd gone. They were gone now, vanished past the tree line, into the streets beyond, and with them, they took the peace he usually found here. Shaq remained for a while, trying to put the pieces together. This cemetery was full of ghosts, but not all of them were buried. That note opened something. It made the silence louder, the wind colder, the questions sharper. As the light shifted and the sun crawled westward, he sat on the bench near the statue, let the hours bleed. He didn't want to leave. Something had shifted. Not just the memory of Quincy, but the story itself. Someone else was living with guilt. Someone who cried for a boy she never knew, and left a message for a man she'd never met. Shaq pulled out his phone, not to call anyone, but to open his gallery. He scrolled to the picture, the last one ever taken of Quincy, a blurry Polaroid from a barbecue. Both of them laughing, mouths open wide, smoke rising from the grill. He stared at it longer than usual. That grave had been silent for years, until today. And Big Shaq? He didn't believe in coincidences. Not here, not in Cypress Hills. Shaq didn't follow her, not out of hesitation, but respect. Sometimes grief needed distance, and yet distance never worked for him. Every year he returned to the same graveyard, to the same gravestone etched with a friend's name and a history too heavy for marble to carry. This time, though, Quincy's memory wasn't the only thing weighing on his chest. That note, crumpled now in his pocket, warm from his palm, made the past feel unfinished. Like a book someone else had picked up and started rewriting without permission. She knew his name. Not the name that made headlines or sat on banners over basketball courts, but the one that mattered. Big Shaq. That was the name Quincy used when they were kids. Back when the world still felt like it could be changed with mixtapes and pickup games. Before everything became about survival. Shaq walked slowly through the cemetery, eyes locked on the gate where she'd disappeared. He wasn't trying to chase her. Not really. He was trying to understand something that didn't make sense. The kind of grief she carried wasn't rehearsed, and yet it was aimed at a stranger's grave. Quincy wasn't her kin, and she didn't grow up on Fairview Street where everyone knew everyone. That part of town was tight and troubled, poor, black, overlooked, the kind of place where if you didn't belong, you didn't stay long. He sat back on the bench again, and let the weight of the past speak. 18 years ago, when he and Quincy were 17, they got stopped walking home from a night out at Nico's corner store. They had sodas, chips, and a couple of basketball mags in their backpacks. A cruiser pulled up, lights off, just gliding to the curb. 2 officers stepped out, one white, one tired. Shaq remembered the questions, the looks, the silence that was demanded of them. Quincy had spoken first. "We didn't do nothin'," he'd said, voice even but eyes wide. The one word that followed, "run," came from nowhere, but it echoed like thunder. Quincy ran. Shaq didn't. He stood frozen. That was the last time he saw his friend alive. Later, the news said Quincy had fallen from a construction site. Trespassing. Gang suspected. No witnesses. They buried him before the truth could catch up. And Shaq learned early. Some stories didn't get chapters. They got erased. He hadn't run since. Not from truth. Not from the past. Now here he was, decades later, holding a stranger's apology and trying to fit it into a narrative that had long since stopped making sense. The grave had always been silent, always cold, but now it whispered something else, that someone else had been there all along, watching from the edge. Shaq rose and walked back to Quincy's grave, reading it again like it might give him new answers. The soil still felt unsettled. The air carried a tightness in the chest, like standing too close to something radioactive. His fingers brushed over the granite. To Big Shaq, "I'm sorry, I never knew."
What didn't she know?
What had she learned now that made her cry like that? He needed clarity, not answers. So he left the cemetery without a destination, but his feet guided him instinctively. The neighborhood hadn't changed much. Corner stores still had the same peeling lotto signs, the same busted payphone out front, the same narrow sidewalks where bikes scraped knees and sirens filled the night. A block from Quincy's old house stood a diner with windows fogged by grease and time. He hadn't been there in years, but something, maybe memory, maybe intuition, pulled him closer. The sign above the door read, "Dixie's Diner." The name rang no bells. The windows framed tired people and tired booths, and behind the counter stood the same woman who'd cried at Quincy's grave. Shaq stepped inside, unnoticed at first. The bell above the door gave a single tired chime. A man in his 60s sipped black coffee by the window. while a couple of teens argued quietly near the back. The woman, the waitress, moved with the muscle memory of exhaustion. Her eyes shadowed, her shoulders pulled in. The child was nowhere to be seen. She walked toward his booth, pad and pen in hand, not looking up. Coffee? Shaq nodded. She still hadn't recognized him, or was pretending not to. Her voice was softer than he'd expected. You want cream or sugar? Just black, he said, watching her closely. Her head twitched up, just a fraction. She blinked once, maybe twice. The tray in her hand tilted slightly before she corrected it, but she didn't speak, just turned away to pour the coffee. When she returned, she placed it down without a word. Shaq waited, hoping she'd say something. Nothing came. Name's Shaq, he said quietly. She nodded, her face unreadable. I know. How? She turned to leave again. It's not my story to tell. He didn't press. He watched her walk back behind the counter, bus a table, refill a cup. Her hands moved fast, efficient, but her eyes betrayed her, flicking toward him every few seconds. Not fear, something closer to guilt or recognition she didn't want to have. He stayed an hour, didn't touch the coffee. When he finally left, she didn't stop him, didn't call out, but as he walked past the register, he saw it, taped to the side of the tip jar, folded and yellowed with age, a photo. 2 boys laughing in a backyard. One tall, one wiry, both full of life. He knew that photo. It was the same one he kept on his phone. It had only ever existed in one copy. Shaq stepped out into the sunlight, with the street humming beneath his feet. Something deeper had cracked. That photo hadn't just shown up there. Someone had put it there because Quincy's story hadn't ended the way they told it. And now it was reaching for him again. He didn't know her name, didn't know her connection, but she'd carried that grief for a long time, and somehow, it was tied to Quincy's death. He walked for hours after that, through the back streets of his old neighborhood, down alleyways and parks that still held the ghosts of sneakers on pavement. The more he tried to forget that photo, the louder it screamed. The photo, the note, the waitress, the kid. None of it aligned. That night, he didn't sleep much. He played back every memory he had of Quincy. The times they skipped school to shoot hoops behind the church. The way Quincy could freestyle with nothing but an empty beat and a pencil tapping on a notebook. The laughter, the fire, the fear. He remembered how Quincy had warned him once. Some truths, man. They don't come clean. They come bleeding. Now it felt like something or someone was trying to wash those truths clean after all this time. But not with blood, with tears. The kind that belonged to someone who wasn't there when it all happened, but somehow still carried the scars. The next morning, Shaq went back to Cypress Hills. Same hoodie, same silence. But this time, something new clung to the air. Tension, expectation. The note was gone. Either the wind had taken it, or someone had returned for it. Quincy's grave felt different again. The peace was gone. In its place, a slow-growing question he couldn't shake. Who was she? And why did she look like someone who had waited too long to speak the truth? He stared at the empty grass beside the grave, where her knees had pressed into the soil. A piece of thread from her uniform was still there, red and frayed, barely visible, but real enough. He picked it up, held it in his palm. The past wasn't done with him yet. And maybe, just maybe, neither was Quincy. Shaq sat in his car across the street from the diner, parked under the shadow of a lamppost that hadn't worked since the year Quincy died. It was past closing. The sidewalk was empty, save for the rustle of rappers skating across cracked pavement and the flicker of a neon sign gasping in its final hour. The note hadn't left his hand all day. The handwriting was jagged, the ink bleeding at the edges as though the words had been forced through a storm of shaking hands and unresolved guilt. He unfolded it again. Even though he'd read it so many times he could have recited it blind. Big Shaq. I never knew the truth. I never knew who he really was. I thought it was just another story. Just another black kid they buried and blamed. But now I know. And I'm sorry. I should have spoken up when I had the chance. You deserve to know what they did. He deserved better. There was no name, no date, just that trembling confession, a bridge between her grief and his memory. But Shaq had learned to read beneath the surface. This wasn't guilt from a bystander. This was the kind of sorrow that came from someone who'd once believed a lie so deeply, it took years to unlearn it. And then came the name. Lennox. He hadn't heard it spoken, not yet, but when the child with her slipped and called out Mama Lennox outside the cemetery gate earlier that morning, it stuck. The child's voice echoed now, not frightened, just tired, like he'd seen more than a boy ever should. Shaq stepped out of the car and moved across the street. He wasn't creeping, but he wasn't loud either. His size could fill a room, but he knew how to disappear when he needed to. Being underestimated had its advantages. Even giants can move silent when truth demands it. The side alley next to the diner led to the staff entrance. A metal door half hung on rusted hinges. The lot out back was empty except for a single dented Civic. Light glowed from an upstairs window, a small apartment likely built above the diner for workers who couldn't afford to leave. He waited, not out of fear but consideration, and then he saw her. Lennox. She stepped out the back door in a faded hoodie, balancing a garbage bag in one hand and shielding her eyes from the light with the other. Her sleeves rolled up as she stretched, revealing deep purplish blotches on her forearms. Not fresh bruises, but old, worn ones. The kind you get from lifting trays, washing grease-caked pans, hauling weight that wasn't meant for one person. Her body carried exhaustion like a second skin. And beneath it all, fear. Not of a person, but of memory, of what she might have said too late. Shaq didn't speak. He stood far enough to not startle her, but close enough to be seen if she chose to look. She did. Her eyes didn't widen. Her mouth didn't part in shock. She just froze for a moment, like time held her in place while her mind replayed everything she thought she'd buried. "You writ it?" she asked softly, voice trailing off in the night air. Shaq gave a single nod. Lennox exhaled, as if she'd just put something down she'd been holding for years. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. Instead, she pointed toward the upstairs window. "Ari's asleep. It's the only time the silence doesn't hurt." Shaq walked closer, still cautious, still respectful. "I didn't know him," she said. "Not Quincy, not really. Just knew what they said. Just knew what I wasn't supposed to ask." "You wrote to me like you knew," Shaq said, his voice a slow thunder in the quiet. Lennox leaned against the wall, arms folded tight like armor. "I knew what he wasn't, and that counts for something now." He waited, let the silence do what it needed to. "I was a kid when it happened. Just 10. My father worked for the county. Roads and zoning. That night he came home late, dirty, quiet. He reeked of sweat and panic. Didn't say a word. Next morning, the front page talked about a black teen found dead near the abandoned tracks. Said it was gang-related. Said he had priors." Shaq's fists clenched reflexively. Quincy had never had priors. The only thing he'd ever stolen was a mixtape Shaq already owned. "But my father never read the news," Lennox continued. "He just stared out the window for days. When I asked why he looked so scared, he told me, some things are too big for little girls." Shaq didn't interrupt. He wanted it all now. Every crack in the wall she'd spent years building. "A few years later, I found out the town had buried the report. The autopsy was rushed. The scene was sealed before investigators arrived. The story they fed the press was printed before Quincy's body even made it to the morgue." Shaq's heart pounded, the beat echoing through his temples. "Who changed the story?" Lennox looked up, her eyes glassy. "People with last names that opened doors. People like the Durrells." He hadn't heard that name in years, but he knew it. Everyone in town did. The Durrell family owned properties, political ties, and silence. Quincy had once gotten into a fight with Gavin Durrell in sophomore year. Everyone knew Gavin threw the first punch, but Quincy was the one suspended. "What did your father do?" Shaq asked. Lennox hesitated. He cleaned the scene. Said the town couldn't afford bad press. Said he was just doing his job, but it broke him. Drank himself to death 6 years later. Shaq paced a few steps away, trying to let the rage pass without igniting. "I found your photo," Lennox said. "You and Quincy, taped behind my father's toolbox, like it haunted him, like he needed to remember what he'd helped erase. That photo, the same one taped on the tip jar." Now the connection clicked. She hadn't just found it, she'd preserved it. "Why now?" Shaq asked. "Why me?" "Because I saw Ari holding a flyer last week," Lennox said. "A basketball camp in Queens, your camp." And he pointed at your face and said, "That man looks like someone from Mama's photo." Shaq stared at her, realization dawning slow and heavy.
"That photo was the only thing left from the truth. And when I saw him recognize it, I knew I couldn't let Quincy stay buried in lies."
Shaq ran a hand over his face, trying to steady the tide inside. "Why write to me?" "Because no one else would believe me," she said. "I waited too long. The people who mattered forgot him. But you didn't. You came back every year. I saw you once last July, watched from behind a tree. I wanted to speak then, but the words, they never came out." Shaq looked toward the diner's back door. The world behind it was too small to hold the weight of what had just been said, but it had held it anyway. "Do you want justice?" he asked finally. Lennox didn't answer immediately. She looked up at the sky, the stars blurred by city haze, I want truth. Whatever's left of it. Not just for Quincy, for my son, so he doesn't grow up thinking silence is safety. Shaq nodded slowly, his resolve setting like steel. I'll come back tomorrow, he said. Lennox tilted her head. To do what? To finish what they started, he replied. And with that, he turned and walked back into the night, leaving the note and the past where they belonged, not buried, but awake. The morning light hadn't fully settled over the town when Shaq pulled up to the diner again. The sky wore a dull gray overcoat, like it couldn't quite commit to being day or night. Everything in this town, the sidewalks, the windows, the people, seemed caught in that same in-between. Not entirely awake, not completely dead, just stuck. He parked a block down, away from the chipped front of Dixie's diner, and approached on foot, blending in as best he could in a hoodie and a pair of scuffed boots. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed like nervous energy, the kind that sets your teeth on edge without you realizing why. The place smelled like burnt grease and cheap soap. The floors were yellowed with age, and the counter had a permanent lean. There were 3 booths occupied, 2 by old men with flannel jackets and weathered eyes, 1 by a middle-aged woman fidgeting with a pill organizer. No one looked up when Shaq entered. No one greeted him. This place didn't traffic in kindness or curiosity. Lennox was behind the counter. She moved with the kind of rhythm that came from years of doing the same thing every day, pouring coffee with one hand while scribbling down orders with the other. Her expression was distant, her posture closed. She didn't glance up when Shaq chose a booth near the back, half-shadowed by a flickering ceiling light. He didn't wave, didn't acknowledge last night. Today he was just a customer. That's how she needed it. A few minutes passed before she walked over. No pen, no pad, just a dull stare that didn't reach him. What'll it be? Coffee, eggs, wheat toast, if you've got it. She nodded, barely. He watched her go. Her arms were covered today, long sleeves pulled tight to the wrist. No bruises visible, but they were there in the slump of her shoulders, the way she moved like someone permanently braced for impact. Shaq scanned the room, letting his senses stretch. The walls were lined with sun-faded photos of county fairs, trophy fish, and high school football teams that hadn't seen a playoff since VHS tapes. A dusty jukebox near the door blinked but made no sound. One of the old men at the counter cleared his throat with theatrical disdain, shooting a glance in Shaq's direction. Then came the moment. A plate slammed hard against the counter, loud enough to make the spoon in Shaq's cup jump. The sound bounced around the diner like a ricochet. A white man with a beer gut and a jaw full of chew barked toward the kitchen window. Damn, food's colder than my ex-wife. Y'all hiring more of them lazy ones now? No one reacted. Not the other customers. Not the cook in the back. Not even Lennox, who stood motionless behind the counter, her face a studied blank. But Shaq saw her knuckles go pale as she gripped the edge of the register. The man wasn't drunk. He didn't need to be. This was just his morning voice. Shaq kept his expression neutral. He didn't get up. He didn't confront the man. He'd been through enough to know that not every war needed a battlefield. Some you fought by watching, by remembering, by returning. The food arrived, thin and overcooked. He didn't touch it. Instead, his eyes found the register, an old steel model, with buttons too big and too loud. Tucked next to it was a chipped coffee can, painted red once, but mostly gray now from use. It had a piece of paper taped to it, a tip's help scrawl written in faded Sharpie. And behind the can, wedged between receipts and sugar packets, was a photo. It wasn't facing the customers, angled instead like it was meant to be seen only from behind the counter. But Shaq knew it the second he saw the corner of a grin, that gap-toothed smile, the busted Celtics jersey, the arm slung over a much younger Shaq's shoulder. It was Quincy, again, still. That picture kept appearing like a ghost, trying to finish a sentence. Lennox came back to refill his coffee. Shaq didn't speak, neither did she, but he let his eyes flick toward the can, slow and deliberate. She followed his gaze. Their eyes met for the first time that morning. Just a second, but it was enough. I found it in my father's drawer, she said quietly, like the words were being pried out one at a time. Didn't know who it was until last year. Didn't know what it meant. Shaq stirred his coffee, though he didn't drink it. Why put it there? So I don't forget, she said. No matter how many mouths I serve or plates I scrub, I don't forget whose silence this town is built on. A bell above the door rang, and another customer entered. Lennox straightened and walked away, her mask slipping back into place. Shaq sat there for a long while, the food untouched, the coffee cold, the photo burning in the back of his mind. He wasn't here to relive the past, he was here to reckon with it. There was a difference. Around noon, the diner started to fill up. A group of utility workers came in, boots thick with mud, language thicker. They didn't see Shaq or pretended not to, but he noticed the way the volume changed when they laughed, how the jokes hovered just close enough to the edge of insult. Through it all, Lennox moved like a ghost in her own skin. She smiled when necessary. She poured without listening, and when she thought no one was looking, her eyes drifted back to the photo behind the counter. Shaq finally stood, pulled a 20 from his wallet, folded it once, and dropped it into the coffee can. He made sure his fingers brushed the edge of the photo. Lennox saw it. She didn't move. As he turned to leave, she said one thing, soft but clear. "He used to come in here, Quincy, once or twice, before it all." Shaq paused. "I remember," she added. He laughed big, louder than anyone else in the room. Shaq didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He just nodded once and walked out into the street, the door closing behind him with a whisper of a world still stuck in a past it refused to bury. The echoes of that diner would follow him. They always did. But now they had a new voice, one that wasn't just Quincy's. It was Lennox's. And she had more to say. The town had its own way of protecting itself, not with walls or fences, but with silence. A hush that blanketed certain names, certain streets, certain nights in history that never made it to record. What wasn't written down couldn't be questioned, and what wasn't questioned never had to be answered. But Shaq had spent too many years living with the aftershocks of a story that didn't end right, and now the silence felt louder than it ever had. He started asking questions, not with a microphone, not in front of cameras, but in the quiet places where people still remembered without wanting to. The barber shop near the corner of Green and Wallace. The shoe repair guy who'd been working the same corner since Reagan was in office. A woman who used to babysit kids from the east side and spoke only in fragments and sighs. Everyone remembered Quincy. But the memory always came with hesitation. Like bringing his name back up would also resurrect the truth people had spent years trying to suppress. He was a good kid, the barber had said, keeping his eyes on the scissors in his hand. Always kept his laces clean. That means something, but he got caught up in something too big for any of us to untangle. Shaq didn't press, he just listened. It wasn't until he found himself back near the old high school that he ran into someone who didn't shrink from the memory. The building looked older than it was, sun-warped brick, windows clouded with grime, a flag that hadn't been replaced since the first Bush administration. A truck with no plates and a busted bumper sat parked near the side exit. Shaq recognized it. More importantly, he recognized the man sitting on the bench beside it. Mr. Otis Calloway, the old janitor. Retired now but still showed up most mornings with a thermos of black coffee and a mind full of stories no one asked for anymore. Calloway spotted Shaq before Shaq said a word. "I know that walk," he muttered, patting the space beside him. "Still wide like you got a full court press behind you." Shaq chuckled softly and sat. The wood groaned under his weight. But Calloway didn't flinch. "You came back for him, didn't you?" the old man asked, not bothering with names. Shaq nodded slowly. "I never really left." Calloway took a sip from his thermos and stared out at the empty field beyond the school. "They buried more than your friend that night." The words hung between them like smoke. Shaq didn't speak. He let the man unpack it at his own pace. "I was here late that night," Calloway continued. "The district had me fixing broken toilets because the maintenance guy quit. Around 11, I heard tires screech out back. Kids yelling. Sounded like panic, not joy." Shaq's eyes narrowed. This was new. He leaned in slightly.
"I didn't go out. That was my mistake," Calloway said. "But the next morning, the football field had tracks on it. Muddy like someone drove across the lawn. Nobody asked about it. 2 days later, Quincy was dead, and the report said he'd been found near the old freight yard."
Calloway shifted on the bench and reached into his coat. He pulled out a small, worn notebook, the kind people stopped using once cell phones took over. He flipped through the pages until he landed on one marked in red ink. "Names I heard that week," he said. "Not from police. From whispers. Gavin Durrell, Colton Briggs, Tyler Nix. All white boys. All seniors. None of them questioned. But they were at the school that night. That much I know." Shaq's heart hammered beneath his chest. He knew that name. Gavin Durrell. The golden boy. His father had been mayor once. Owned half the rental properties in town. Gavin had been the kid who got away with everything. Quincy had once told Shaq Gavin would throw bricks through windows just to watch how long it took cops to blame someone else. "They said Quincy was trespassing," Shaq said quietly. "Said he fell." Calloway laughed bitterly. "Quincy wasn't trespassing. He was running." "From what?" "From being black. From being in the wrong place at the wrong time. From being smarter than they liked." Shaq felt the chill settle in his bones. It wasn't just about Quincy's death. It was about the system that wrapped itself around the Durrell name like armor. About the version of events that was printed before any real questions had been asked. He flipped the notebook over in his hands. "Why didn't you speak up?" Calloway looked down at his thermos. "'Cause no one was listening back then. And because I had grandkids to feed." Silence again. "But I remember," Calloway said, voice firm now. "And so does someone else." Shaq turned to him. "Lennox." The name didn't surprise Shaq, but the way Calloway said it did. "She was there," Calloway continued. "Saw something she wasn't supposed to. Her father was fixing the gym boiler that night. Brought her along, said she fell asleep in the storage room. But that girl never slept through noise. I think she saw what happened, and they made sure she forgot it." Shaq swallowed hard. "You think she knows who did it?" "I think she's been trying not to know for 18 years. Shaq stood, pulse heavy, head spinning. Everything was shifting now. The photo, the note, the fear in Lennox's eyes. She wasn't just connected to Quincy by regret. She was a witness, maybe the only one left. He turned to Calloway. "Why now? Why are you telling me this?" Calloway looked up at him, expression tired but unwavering. "Because my bones are older than the lies, and because I see that same fire in you your friend had. You don't let this die quiet, not this time." Shaq nodded once, heart pounding. The town had kept its secrets buried long enough. The whispers had gotten loud. And now the choice was his. Let it lie. Or bring the storm. Shaq didn't plan to see Ari again that day. He had left the school and Calloway's whispers behind him, his mind running miles ahead of his body, trying to connect pieces of a puzzle that kept reshaping itself. But the town had a way of rerouting his steps, as if every backstreet was pulling him deeper, pressing the past closer. The diner lot, cracked and sun-faded like the town itself, became his next stop, though he hadn't meant it to be. Ari stood by the dumpster, bouncing a half-flat rubber ball between his hands. He was alone, humming a broken tune that didn't seem to belong to any song Shaq knew. His shirt was too big, sleeves hanging down like they were borrowed. But it wasn't the clothes that caught Shaq's eye. It was the shoes. The kid was wearing his shoes. Not just a pair made in his name. Not one of the dozens of models that bore the Shaq brand, but that pair, limited edition, all black suede with gold trim, a commemorative run of just 25 given to close friends and a few youth outreach kids back in the day. Shaq had handed those out himself. He remembered every name, every hand that received a box. No way those shoes got here by chance. Ari didn't notice him at first, just kept bouncing the ball, lost in his rhythm. Shaq moved closer, slow and measured, until the kid finally looked up. There was no fear in Ari's eyes, just curiosity, sharp and silent. The same look he'd given Shaq at the cemetery. "You like those?" Shaq asked, nodding toward the shoes. Ari looked down. "They're too big," he said, "but Mama said I'll grow into 'em." Shaq crouched a little to meet his eye. "Where'd she get 'em?" Ari shrugged, the kind of shrug that carries innocence or secrecy. "Maybe both. They were in a box, in the closet. She told me not to take 'em out, but I did anyway." Shaq felt the weight of the answer settle around him. These shoes weren't thrifted. They weren't bought off eBay. Someone gave them to Lennox, or gave them to whoever had been around before Ari was born. The list of possible owners shrank in his mind, until it landed on a chilling thought. Quincy had never gotten a pair. He died before that release. So how did Lennox end up with them? He stood again, glancing toward the back of the diner. No Lennox in sight, just the tired hum of the freezer unit, the screen door shifting slightly in the wind. He turned back to Ari. "Your mom ever talk about your dad?" Ari's head tilted. "Not really. I asked once. She said, 'He's part of your story, but not your path.' I didn't get it." Shaq did. It was something people said when they didn't want to tell the truth, or when the truth was too heavy to give to a child. "Ever meet him?" Ari shook his head. "I don't think so." Shaq forced a smile. "You like basketball?" Ari grinned wide. "Yeah. I can dribble with both hands." "I bet you can." Shaq looked down at the shoes again. They were scuffed now, a kid's wear and tear visible across the suede, but unmistakably the same pair. There was no escaping it. These came from someone in Shaq's inner circle, someone who'd once stood close enough to be handed the past in a shoebox. He offered a fist bump. Ari returned it with the kind of pride only kids know how to wear. Then Lennox appeared in the doorway. Her eyes locked on Ari, then Shaq. For a moment her face didn't move, but her body went still. The kind of still that only shows up when someone realizes something they've been hiding is no longer safe. "I told you not to wear those outside," she said to Ari, her voice firmer than usual. Ari backed away a step, shoulders curling. Sorry, Mama. Go inside. Wash up. He hesitated, then ran in, the door squeaking behind him. Shaq didn't speak right away. Neither did Lennox. You want to tell me where those came from? He asked. Lennox leaned against the frame, arms folded tight, gaze locked on something far away. They were left at my door one night. Box and all, no note, no knock. Who brought them? I never saw, she said. I thought maybe someone was trying to help. Maybe trying to remind me Quincy wasn't forgotten. Shaq took a step forward. That's not the kind of gift strangers leave. Those shoes weren't just rare, they were personal. I gave them out by hand. Lennox didn't answer. Her jaw tightened. You knew that. She nodded slowly. Eventually. Yeah. Shaq narrowed his eyes. Who gave them to you, Lennox? She didn't blink. I don't know. You're lying. Her face crumpled for half a second, before she straightened again. No, I'm protecting. Shaq's chest went tight. Protecting who? Silence. You think Quincy's killer gave you those shoes? Lennox looked down, her voice low and fragile. I think someone who knew what happened that night, maybe someone who was part of it, has been trying to keep me quiet. I think those shoes were a message.
What kind of message?
That I was being watched. That they still had reach. Shaq stepped closer. Or maybe they were a confession. Her eyes snapped up. You said the town covered up Quincy's death. You said your father kept quiet. But somebody out there remembers, Lennox. Somebody regrets it. And maybe they thought giving Ari those shoes would balance something. She swallowed hard. Nothing balances that night. Shaq nodded. Then help me. Who else was around you back then? Who knew your father? Who's still in town? Lennox hesitated. Gavin Durrell's brother, Morgan. He was just a kid then, but he's something now. Runs zoning, real estate. He's in everything. You think he's involved? I think he's the only one who's gotten more powerful since Quincy died. Shaq's mind raced. Morgan Durrell, a name he remembered seeing on foundation letters and building permits. The younger brother of a boy who'd started fights and vanished into privilege. He took a deep breath. You think Morgan's Ari's father? Lennox looked stricken. No. God, no. That's not what this is. Then who is? She looked toward the door, her voice a whisper. Someone who never should have died. Someone they buried too fast. Shaq froze. Ari's father is dead? Lennox nodded once. And he's buried here, in this town. She didn't speak, but her silence said enough. Now it made sense. The secrecy, the shoes, the photo, the fear. Ari wasn't a loose thread. He was a knot, tying together two deaths, 2 generations, and a lie so carefully maintained it had begun to rot from the inside. Shaq looked up at her. We dig this up, it's not going to stay quiet. I know, she said. You ready for that? No, she admitted. But Ari deserves to know who his father was. Shaq stared past her, past the diner, past the horizon this town had drawn like a cage. There were still names to chase, still truths buried with the dead. But now, they had a trail. And the next grave he visited wouldn't be Quincy's. The town fell into its usual stillness after dark, a kind of quiet that didn't feel like peace but rather a pact. A hush agreed upon by old men, closed doors and crooked laws. The kind of silence that let ghosts breathe. Shaq sat alone in the back booth of the diner, long after the last customer had gone, after the open sign had been flipped, after even the cook had left without a word. The lights were low, humming quietly above him. Lennox stood behind the counter, drying the same coffee mug over and over with a rag already stained. She hadn't said much since she'd sat Ari to bed. The kid had gone out like a light, sneakers kicked off by the couch, one of Shaq's old game tapes playing quietly in the background. Shaq didn't push. He waited. That was something Quincy had taught him, how to wait until someone's truth spilled out on its own. Some stories couldn't be forced. They had to be unburied. Lennox placed the mug down, walked over, and slid into the booth across from him. Her eyes were different tonight, not wide with fear or tight with secrets, just tired and ready. I was 7 when it happened, she said. No preamble, no warning, just the sound of a woman lifting the lid off years of silence. It was summer. The air was thick like soup, and my mom was mad 'cause the AC was broken. Dad got called in to fix the boiler at the school gym. He took me with him 'cause Mama said she needed space. She glanced at the window as if the past was waiting just beyond the glass. He sat me down with a juice box in the supply closet. Said he'd be 15 minutes. Told me not to leave. Said I could color on the clipboard. I was quiet back then, always listening, never asking. She took a breath, then continued. I heard yelling. I remember the sound more than the words. Fast, angry, sharp. I crept out the closet, just to the edge of the hallway. The gym doors were open, lights on full. That's when I saw him. Her voice softened, but the weight didn't. Quincy. Running. Shaq didn't move, just listened. He came out first. He looked scared, real scared. His shirt was ripped, and there was blood on his forehead. But it wasn't his. I know that now. He was holding something in his hand, I think a wallet. He dropped it as he ran past the janitor closet. Lennox's hands gripped each other. Then Gavin came out. Gavin Durrell. I knew who he was. Everyone did. His family's name was on the rec center, on the library bricks, even on the stupid holiday banners down Main. He was bigger than Quincy. Older too. And angry. Like calculated angry. He walked, didn't run. Looked around like he owned the place. Shaq's fingers tapped gently on the table, absorbing every word. I remember Gavin staring at the hallway mirror. You know, the long one by the trophy case. He looked at himself, adjusted his collar, like he had all the time in the world. That's when I saw the blood on his knuckles. Her voice trembled but didn't break. He picked up the wallet, looked around once. Then he put it in Quincy's backpack, which was lying near the bleachers. That part I didn't understand. Not then, not until later. Shaq exhaled slowly. He framed him. Lennox nodded. Quincy ran, 'cause he thought someone would believe him. Gavin stayed, 'cause he knew no one would believe the truth. She leaned back, eyes unfocused. Next morning, Quincy was missing. 2 days later, they found his body by the old freight yard. Head trauma. Ruled accidental. They said he was in a gang. Said he'd been fighting with another group over turf. No one asked how he got from the school to the yard. No one asked how a kid with no record, no enemies, suddenly ended up dead on a track that hadn't been used in years. Shaq clenched his jaw. Because Gavin's name couldn't show up in that story. No, she whispered. Because the town couldn't afford it. He let the silence settle before he asked the next question. Why didn't you speak up? Lennox looked at him then, eyes heavy with time. Because I was a kid. And because my father found out I'd seen it. I told him everything, thinking he'd call the cops. He didn't. He yelled. He panicked. He said if I ever repeated it, we'd have to leave town for good. Said they'd find a way to ruin us. Shaq nodded slowly. And you left. 3 weeks later, moved in with my mom's sister in Illinois. New school, new name. I grew up trying to forget what I saw. But you didn't. I couldn't, she said. Because Quincy's eyes that night, the way he looked back over his shoulder, it stayed with me. He wasn't running from guilt, he was running from a lie. Shaq leaned in. So why come back now? Lennox reached into her apron and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Old, crinkled at the edges. She slid it across the table. It was a death certificate. Shaq read it slowly. Name Darius Wade. Cause of death, undetermined trauma. Age 19. Date, July 17, 2008. Shaq looked up. Who is this? Lennox's voice cracked. Ari's father. She took another breath. Darius was sweet, quiet, worked at the old gas station on Route 4. We met one summer, while I was visiting my aunt again. He was kind, real kind, the kind of man you keep. We weren't together long, barely a year, but he mattered. Shaq studied her. What happened? He died the same week I told him about what I saw. I didn't connect it then, thought it was a freak accident. He was found at the edge of the quarry. Head injuries. Same kind of accidental trauma Quincy had. No suspects, no follow-up. Another name buried without answers. Shaq's breath caught. You think they killed him? I think I talked too much, and I think someone wanted to make sure I never opened my mouth again. She leaned forward now. I came back here because I need this to stop. I'm not just some tired waitress. I'm a witness to 2 deaths. 2 boys who didn't deserve what happened to them. And I can't keep pretending I'm just passing through. Shaq stared at her. Why me? Because you never stopped coming back to that grave. Because even when the whole town moved on, you didn't. Quincy needs his name cleared. Darius needs his son to know the truth. And I need someone big enough, loud enough, and impossible to silence. The weight of her words sank in deep. Lennox reached across the table and took his hand. I can't fight this alone, but I think you can make them listen. Shaq looked down at her hand, then back at the woman who had been a silent survivor all these years, and realized that justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. And it was whispering through her. The whispers started first. Not the kind that came from people in alleys or behind closed doors, but the ones that traveled with looks, side glances from men in pickup trucks, long pauses from cashiers who suddenly forgot to greet, conversations that cut off when Shaq walked into a room. The same streets that had once cheered for him, that once called him Big Shaq with pride in their throats, now called him something else with their silence. He hadn't even gone public. He hadn't made a statement. But this town had a nose for unease, and it could smell when someone was kicking at the rot beneath its floorboards. Shaq knew it would come. The moment he decided to follow the truth instead of bury it, he knew whose names would start circling back, and at the top of that list was one that had waited 18 years in the shadows. Darrell. But it wasn't Gavin who came calling. It was Morgan. Gavin's younger brother. The cleaner one. The one with the business cards and the political ambitions. While Gavin had swaggered through the town like a wrecking ball in his youth, Morgan had studied it, understood how to manipulate it from inside out. By 30, he had a controlling stake in zoning permits, a grip on real estate development, and enough ties to city council to have his own parking spot behind town hall. The Darrells didn't need fists when they had foundations, donations, and quiet influence. The meeting didn't come in a boardroom or an office. It came in a parking lot. Shaq was exiting the community center after checking in with a youth program he'd funded, an attempt to put something good into a place where too much had gone bad. When the sleek black Lincoln Navigator pulled up behind his truck, out stepped Morgan, polished as ever in a charcoal suit, and loafers that had never touched real dirt. "Mr. O'Neill," Morgan called out, voice too friendly to trust. Or should I say Big Shaq? Shaq didn't answer right away. He just leaned against his door, arms folded, gaze unreadable. Morgan smiled, stepping forward like he was about to shake hands at a fundraiser. "You know, it's always good when someone successful gives back. I've seen you pop up on a few boards lately. Diner donations, youth initiatives, even a quiet little scholarship fund in Quincy Wells' name. Classy." Shaq stared, still saying nothing. Morgan's smile twitched. "But I gotta ask, what's brought all this attention now, after all these years?" Shaq's voice came low and even. "Some things deserve to be remembered." "Sure," Morgan nodded, "but there's remembering, and then there's rewriting. And from what I hear, you've been asking around. Names, dates, old incidents. That's a dangerous habit in a town this small." Shaq tilted his head. "You threatening me?" Morgan laughed, quick, rehearsed. No, just offering advice. This town doesn't hold grudges the way you think it does. It just prefers quiet. That's how things work best. Less mess, more peace." "You mean, less truth?" Morgan took a step closer, voice still calm but tighter now. "You come into a place like this, stirring up ghosts. You better be ready for what follows. People forget the good you've done real fast when you make them uncomfortable." Shaq straightened. Uncomfortable's not the same as wrong. Morgan nodded slowly, then pulled out a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and handed it over. Shaq took it, unfolded it, and stared at what he already suspected, a copy of a property violation notice addressed to Lennox's apartment. "Building code infraction," Morgan said. "Odd timing, huh? You've got her dragging skeletons into daylight, and suddenly the city wants to inspect her foundation. You think that's coincidence?" Shaq's eyes didn't move. "You send someone?" Morgan's smile was gone now. "I don't send anyone. I just make sure what happens efficiently." Shaq folded the paper, tucked it into his coat. "Let me guess. You're here to make a deal." "No," Morgan said, straightening his jacket. "Just a courtesy visit. We all want peace, and peace means not chasing stories that are 18 years dead. Quincy's gone. The town's moved on. You should too." Shaq opened the driver's door but didn't get in. "You ever wonder what Quincy might have become?" he asked, voice barely more than a murmur. "You think he'd have been content with quiet, with being erased?" Morgan's jaw flexed once. "We all have ghosts, Mr. O'Neill. Doesn't mean we invite them to dinner." He got back in his car and drove off. Shaq stood there for a moment, watching the black SUV disappear down the street, his pulse steady but his mind racing. It was confirmation. The Darrells weren't just aware, they were worried. Back at the apartment, the front door had a scratch near the lock that hadn't been there yesterday. Lennox noticed it before he did. Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed the door open. Inside, nothing was missing, nothing broken. But things had been moved, just enough to unsettle. A drawer left open, a cup placed upside down. The kind of invasion meant to whisper, not scream. "They're warning me," she said quietly, arms folded across her chest. Shaq checked the back door. Still locked, no signs of forced entry. Whoever it was had a key or a badge. "I should have known they wouldn't leave it alone," Lennox muttered. "They've always been good at making people feel watched." Shaq stepped close. This ends when we stop playing by their rules. She looked up. How? Shaq pulled out his phone and scrolled to a name he hadn't called in years. Nora Delgado, an investigative journalist he'd once helped spotlight inner-city education cuts. Tough, smart, unrelenting, the kind of person who didn't scare easy. He tapped call. It rang once, twice, then Nora speaking. It's Shaq. A pause, then a slow, intrigued breath.
Took you long enough.
I've got a story for you. One they've tried to bury since 2007. Another pause. You just got my full attention. Shaq's voice didn't waver. I need eyes on a town called Briar Hollow. I need background on a man named Morgan Durrell. And I need a camera crew on standby. By morning, she'd have 3 interns digging up everything on Gavin and Morgan Durrell. Tax records, real estate flips, donation trails. And maybe, just maybe, they'd find something the town couldn't hide. Shaq hung up, then turned to Lennox. They came to rattle you, he said. Now it's our turn. The game had changed. It wasn't about old secrets anymore. It was about control, about who got to write the final chapter of a story that began with a boy running through a gym and ended with 2 families shattered. But now? Now the silence was broken, and the Durrells weren't the only ones watching. The call came just before dawn. A quiet ring that split the silence in Shaq's motel room like a crack in glass. He answered groggily, expecting a journalist or maybe Lennox checking in early, but the voice on the other end was neither. This is Nurse Tatum, from Ridgeview. Shaq's chest tightened. Ridgeview was the assisted living facility where Mr. Calloway stayed when he wasn't wandering school grounds or sipping his thermos on the benches behind Briar Hollow High. I'm sorry, she continued, her voice heavy with practiced compassion. Otis passed in his sleep around 3 a.m. Natural causes, peaceful, no suffering. Shaq sat up in bed, the weight of that sentence hitting with more force than he expected. Mr. Calloway had been the only adult during those years who still had enough spine to look at Quincy's story and call it what it was, wrong, and now he was gone. But the nurse wasn't finished. He left a package for you, said you'd come, gave us instructions, said it was important. Shaq drove there without brushing his teeth. Just keys, hoodie, and the weight of unfinished stories. At the front desk, a sealed envelope waited with a small brass key taped inside. Written on the front in blocky, unshaken handwriting were 3 words, for Big Shaq. The key was tagged to a safety deposit box 2 blocks away at the Farmers Mutual Bank, a vault from another era. The manager recognized Shaq on sight, but didn't speak. Just nodded and escorted him to the back where the steel drawers lined the wall like crypts. Inside the box was a single item. An old cassette recorder, heavy, black, the kind with a flip top and physical buttons that clunked when you hit play. Taped to it was a yellowed sticky note in Calloway's handwriting. Press play, no more silence. Shaq sat alone in the vault room and did as instructed. The tape crackled before the voice came. Younger, frightened, recorded years ago but preserved like a scar that never faded. This is Gavin Durrell. I don't know who's gonna hear this. I want to say it out loud once. The voice trembled, uncertain, but the weight behind the words built fast. Quincy saved me, that night at the gym. I started the fight with Darius. I don't know why. I was angry, drunk. Darius shoved me first, but I hit him with the flashlight. He didn't get back up. Quincy came in, saw everything. I told him to leave, told him I'd fix it. He wouldn't. Said he had to call someone, said it was murder. So I panicked, told him I'd blame him, told him if he didn't run he'd be the one they'd hang. The tape hissed between words. He ran, and I let him. I let them find him first. Shaq sat there, unmoving. There was more. Mentions of cover-ups, of his father making a call to the sheriff, of cleaning crews, favors exchanged, reports rewritten. But it was the opening line that stayed in his chest like a heartbeat too loud. Quincy saved me, and I let him die. By noon, the recorder was in Nora Delgado's hands. By sunset, her headline ran on 5 independent news wires and was climbing the algorithm on every news app in the region. Durrell confession resurfaces, small-town cover-up, big-name family, and a hero framed. Shaq didn't speak to any press directly. He didn't need to. The tape spoke louder than any interview. By the time night returned, the sheriff had resigned. No press conference, just a signed letter left on his office desk. The DA's office opened a review of Quincy's death. An ethics committee in the zoning department began investigating Morgan Durrell's land deals. The mayor posted a vague statement about community healing that was immediately dragged online. But amidst all of it, In a small kitchen above a diner that still smelled like burnt oil, Lennox sat at the table and cried. Not because she was scared, not even because of the memories, but because no one had been punished. Quincy was still dead. Darius was still gone. And the man who'd whispered that confession into a dusty recorder had never faced a courtroom, never lost $1, never spent a single night haunted the way she had for 2 decades. Shaq sat with her in the quiet. "You did the right thing," he said gently. She wiped her eyes, voice thin. "But is that enough?" Shaq didn't have an answer. And then Ari walked in. Pajamas rumpled, rubbing his eyes. He climbed into Lennox's lap without a word, head on her shoulder, tiny arms wrapping around her neck. It was instinctive, a child's response to tension. Lennox pressed her cheek against his curls. "I told him everything," she whispered. "After you left with the tape, I couldn't hold it anymore." Shaq nodded. "He deserves to know." She looked at him. "That's not all." The next morning, they found out just how far Ari had taken it. At Briar Hollow Elementary, during first period, a teacher overheard Ari speaking to 3 classmates on the playground. "My daddy didn't fall. They hurt him, like they hurt Quincy, but my Uncle Shaq's gonna fix it." By lunchtime, a parent had posted about it in a local Facebook group. By 3 p.m., 2 reporters were waiting outside the school gates. By 4, the principal was fielding calls from the school board and the mayor's office. The town had tried to keep its story quiet for so long, but now a child's voice had ripped it open. No politics, no agendas, just a simple truth that landed like a siren in a place that had grown deaf to justice. And justice, finally, was listening. The wind at Cypress Hills was different this time, gentler, almost respectful, like it had learned to carry the weight of memory without disturbing it. Shaq stood by the grave, the same one he'd visited every July for 18 years, but everything around it had changed. There were new flowers now, not just the silk kind planted by caretakers out of obligation, real ones, yellow marigolds, sunflowers, wild violets, planted by hands that remembered. To his left, Lennox stood quiet and composed, wearing a pale blue dress that billowed at her knees. Her apron was gone, her face softer now, no longer taut with fear. And to his right, holding his hand loosely, was Ari, in polished shoes, shirt tucked in, curls combed back, and a look in his eyes that didn't belong to most kids his age. Shaq looked down at Quincy's headstone. Quincy R. Wells, 1989-2007, the boy who told the truth. The new inscription had been etched just 2 weeks ago, quietly and without ceremony. The old one, which had simply listed his name and date, had been replaced after the truth made headlines, after the whispers turned into confessions, and the town finally agreed on one thing: Quincy had been wronged. And now, he was remembered right. Behind them, a second headstone stood waiting to be unveiled, smaller, newer, draped with a velvet cloth. It stood near the foot of an old oak tree, just shy of where Darius Wade had been buried in anonymity. Lennox stepped forward. Her fingers hesitated at the cloth. She didn't speak right away. When she finally did, her voice was steady. "I asked the city to allow this," she said, eyes sweeping across the small group gathered. A few neighbors, a local reporter, the new mayor, and Nora Delgado scribbling in a notepad off to the side. Because no one should be remembered as a footnote, especially not someone who died trying to do right. She pulled the cloth back, revealing the stone beneath. Darius M. Wade, 1988, when our father, listener, witness to the truth. Never forgotten. Shaq felt a knot in his throat. The words weren't long. They didn't need to be. They said more than any court transcript ever had. Ari stepped forward, staring at the stone. He didn't speak either. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, one of Shaq's old basketball wristbands, and placed it gently at the base of the headstone. For a moment, no one moved. The town, the trees, the sky, all still. Then Lennox leaned in and whispered something into Ari's ear. Ari turned to Shaq and walked over slowly, his shoes crunching the grass. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Shaq nodded, kneeling slightly. "Can I call you Uncle?" The question didn't hit like a blow. It landed like an open door. It wasn't about blood. It was about connection. About the quiet bond forged in grief, truth, and the choice to stand up when it was easier to look away. Shaq smiled and pulled the boy into a hug. "Yeah, you can." Behind them, the town exhaled. Not loudly, not in fanfare, just in subtle shifts. A former councilman who once backed Morgan Durrell's zoning expansions had stepped down. The diner, Dixie's, now had a new name painted across the front in fresh white letters: Lennox's Place. The menu hadn't changed much, but the people inside had. There were conversations now, hard ones, honest ones. Morgan Durrell had gone silent. His office shut down, his development contracts voided in a single city council vote. He hadn't been charged, not officially. But his power had withered, pulled away by exposure and loss of public trust. No one showed up at his fundraisers anymore. No one quoted his family legacy with admiration. His last appearance was a quiet exit from a town hall meeting, where he sat in the back row and slipped out before anyone could ask a question. Justice hadn't arrived in the way movies promised. No gavel-slammed courtroom drama. No handcuffs. But the silence had been broken. The truth had been spoken aloud. And the town, no matter how slow, had shifted. As people trickled away from the cemetery, Shaq remained behind. So did Lennox. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. The air was enough. "I never thought we'd get this far," she finally said. "You did the hardest part," Shaq replied. She looked up at him. "No, you did. You listened." He chuckled lightly. "It took me long enough." They walked together toward the gate, Ari skipping ahead, his footsteps lighter than they'd ever seen. Before they reached the car, a familiar voice called out from the shade of a tree. "Mr. O'Neill." Shaq turned. An older man stood there, thin, hollow-eyed, leaning on a cane. His frame was fragile, but the set of his shoulders suggested weight long carried, a familiar crooked nose, a jawline once sharper. Shaq knew him, not personally, but by the shadow his name had cast. It was Gavin Durrell. Lennox stiffened beside Shaq, her hand tightened around her purse strap. Gavin nodded, almost like an apology. "I'm not here for attention. Just wanted to see it with my own eyes." He gestured toward Quincy's grave. Shaq didn't speak. Gavin stepped closer, slowly. "Cancer, stage 4. Got maybe months, if that." Shaq watched him carefully. The man didn't seem to be fishing for sympathy. "I didn't leave town," Gavin said. "Not because I was brave, because I was ashamed. I listened to that tape after my brother got a hold of it, the one I recorded. I barely remembered saying it. I was out of my mind that night, but every word, every damn word was true." He looked down at the grass. "I never wanted Quincy to die. I was scared, weak, and when my father stepped in, I let him." Lennox's jaw clenched. "You let everyone suffer." "I know." Silence. Then Gavin looked up. "The man Ari calls Grandpa. He doesn't know it, but it was me. I started showing up at the diner 5 years ago, when he was just a toddler. I never introduced myself, just sat, watched, and left. I didn't know he was Darius's son, didn't know anything. I just wanted to be near something I hadn't broken." Lennox's voice was low, razor sharp. "You were still running." "Yes," Gavin said, nodding. "But I'm not anymore." He pulled a small envelope from his coat and held it out to Shaq. "Bank statements, property deeds, recordings, names of the cops my father paid off. Maybe it's late, but it's something." Shaq took the envelope and tucked it inside his jacket. Gavin nodded once more, then turned away. He didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't ask for a conversation. And maybe that was enough. As the sun dropped behind the trees, Shaq turned to look back at the two graves, side by side, marked now not by silence, but by legacy. One of a friend who had been more like a brother, another of a young man who died because truth made people uncomfortable. Both gone too soon. Both remembered now. He looked at Lennox, who had begun to smile again. Not fully, not freely, but it was there. He looked at Ari, who ran ahead shouting something about ice cream and dinosaurs. And he looked inward, finally understanding something Quincy had once said, right before their last pickup game, when the sun was setting just like this. "Real graves don't lie, man, but the people around them might, so it's on us to speak for what can't speak no more." Today they had spoken, and for once the town had listened. If stories like this stir something in you, the need for truth, justice, and the voices that refuse to stay silent, you're exactly where you belong. Stay with us as we uncover what others try to bury, and bring the light to places long left in the dark. Because some stories don't end at the grave, they begin there. And we're just getting started.